Hello and welcome to Coach Talk, the show more interested in ideas and philosophy than facts and history. Now, this episode is brought to you by Coachify. So for those who don't know, Coachify.gg is a website that builds tools to help coaches. Now, you can do the business side of things there, find clients, payments, all that kind of thing. But the thing that's really exciting for someone like me is they created a lot of tools that are very useful for coaches. Now, they're mostly focused at the moment on tools that help with individual coaching, but where we're working together is to build out some of the team offerings and some of the things that will be useful for professional coaches. So if you're like me, I used Notepad and at best a Google Docs, but my excuse is that I'm 30 and I'm not working with teams anymore. So if I was working with teams now, I would definitely want to explore something like this. They have notes that can be connected to VODs, so you can upload your scrims there on YouTube and then give yourself specific timestamps that people can just quickly click through if you want to do follow-ups. You can prepare sessions there, and you can even track goals using the API. So if you set someone play a certain number of games on this champion or do a certain thing on that champion, the website will actually integrate with that information and track it automatically. So if you're interested in checking out Spotify, you can check it out for free using my link down below. There are some paid options, but what I'd recommend is exploring the free options first before you decide or make any decisions about the future. Lastly, if you do that, please can you drop me a message, because the reason that we're working together is I want to help them build these programs to make them as useful as possible to coaches. So I'd really like your feedback if you are using the programs, because we all work, of course, in different ways. Now, on to my guest. My guest this week is Callum Abbot, the chartered exercise and sports psychologist who works with a number of esports teams, as well as having worked across a multitude of different sports as well. We talked about so many interesting, useful things here, tried to get as many practical takeaways for you as possible. We talked about how to beat tilt. We talked about how to give feedback, how to get better at active listening, as well as exploring some of the problems that we face as people and as coaches in esports. And now, without further ado, Callum, what is coaching?
It's a good question. Kind of hard to put all of it, I guess, into one concise, succinct kind of sentence. But I guess to me, coaching is kind of a lot about guidance, support, bringing people along on the journey. I think there's definitely an element of having knowledge and imparting knowledge, but I think a significant part of what makes a coach, or what makes a good coach, a really good coach, I guess, is bringing people along on the journey and being alongside them. Being there for support, being someone that they can perhaps open up to about not just the game, but sometimes wider things. Asking advice of them in terms of things around well-being, performance, and how to train. But I think one of the biggest things I've seen in my time as a psychologist working with teams is that some of the best coaches I've known haven't just taught things; they've taught people how to learn. So they've taught them how to teach themselves almost. So it's often really interesting. But a lot of the best coaches, I would argue, often teach the people they work with how to be coaches themselves. How to coach their own abilities up and how to change the way they're thinking about certain aspects. And also, I guess being a coach or doing coaching allows that angle of sometimes challenge. I think in my experience, some of the best coaches I've worked with are happy to be challenged. They want people to say, actually, are you sure that's the right way? Because it checks them and it checks their own knowledge. Then they can have a debate, maybe learn from each other as well. So I guess, loads there, but long and short of it is, coaching to me is definitely guidance, support, sometimes imparting knowledge, of course, but also being open to, I guess, create something together that's more than just the sum of its parts.
And perhaps a bit more exploratory than teaching and like finding out something new rather than necessarily just coming in with this is a correct thing that you all should know.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think, if I think of lecturing or a lecturer, I've seen some coaches in the past that take that style, and that's of course fine if that's their style. But I would say to me, coaching is far more than being up at the front of the classroom telling people what they should be doing and what they shouldn't. It's some of that, of course, but it's also all these other things, like you say, that discovery journey, a bit more than just imparting. It's finding out together, exploring.
And I think as well, I mean, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong because you've got more experience working in sport as well. But one of the things in esports that I always tell coaches that I'm working with is, I mean, especially League of Legends, but once the game starts, you're not there, you don't get to jump in, you don't even get to make substitutions during the game to kind of impact the flow of the game. You would quite often have substitutions that come on that you've given specific instructions to or something like that, whereas League of Legends especially just starts and that's it. So they have got to be able to lead themselves, they have got to be able to sort of coach themselves, and they have got to be able to adapt to situations that are going to be constantly changing. You can't go through everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that is a huge skill that, if a coach can impart that to players or support players to develop that skill of being able to think on their feet or, explore the, I guess, mechanisms behind coming to these decisions. We can all know via rote learning what the right thing to do is, but do we know how to get there in the moment, when the pressure is on? And the best coaches help their players to kind of be able to work those things out and think about, it's kind of similar to in American football. Obviously, the quarterback has to be such an intelligent, quick thinking player. They have to be able to recognize what the other team is doing. They have to keep in mind their own playbook, and the coach helps with that. But again, they then have this kind of, I guess, what do you call it? I guess we could say flexibility within that to decide on the fly, actually, I'm going to change this up. I'm going to call it audible. I'm going to make players switch around, etc., because of what they've seen. So I guess developing that and allowing players to recognize what they are kind of seeing in the moment and act on that is also a huge skill from coaching, like you say.
Okay. And then getting on to the next subject, you mentioned it there, but you're a sports psychologist. Later on, we'll talk about the differences between, performance coach, mental coach, all that kind of thing. But what is sports psychology, and kind of what exactly do you do with teams?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's one that I've tried to kind of nail down. I think over the many years I've worked in esports and been asked that by teams, by individuals. I think the best way I've kind of got to craft kind of what sports psychology is to me, at least, what it means to me, is it's very much about working with individuals, players, coaches, teams on performance, but also on their well-being. So a lot of what we'll do is working with players so that they can get the best out of themselves in terms of performance, so motivation, confidence, reducing kind of anxiety in key moments, and learning how to train in more efficient ways that work for them as individuals. But we're also very much focused on the well-being side of things. So, it's no good to us if you're 10 out of 10 on performance, but you retire within 3 months because you're burned out. We want to find that happy medium where you can get the performance you want and your team wants from you, but you're not going to burn out instantly. And you have that support there to come and talk to whenever necessary. And I kind of guess in terms of what I exactly do, it's a mix of one-to-one sessions with individuals where we'll work on specific things that they might want to work on. I'm a very keen on the idea of working on positives as well. A lot of what we talk about in esports is often constructive criticism, which is great, essential, obviously for improvement, but we do often forget about, the strengths, what makes us so good at what we do. Could we become the best in the world at what we're already good at? And that could be such a valuable thing that often can be understandably forgotten about in the kind of day-to-day hecticness of esports. So that's kind of what I would do in a one-to-one setting. There are also workshops. So there would be workshops on general topics I think I do around things, again, like motivation, confidence. Momentum is a really interesting one I've enjoyed doing. I did a session recently with with a team in CSGO around momentum in CSGO, and it was fascinating seeing the discussions that came from what is a momentum breaker, what is a momentum maker, and how do we get ourselves in a position to get more momentum makers than we do momentum breakers, and so on, and how do we bounce back from other momentum breakers that other teams put on us. So that was fascinating. And then also there will be organizational work as well. So I'll work with staff in organizations to provide support around kind of organizational psychology, things to help things flow as smooth as possible, open lines of communication, people knowing what the roles and responsibilities are of each other, which obviously tallies very nicely with working with sports teams as well. And that's just really within the esports space. I do work in traditional sports as well. I've worked with England Athletics, where a lot of the similar skills I've just discussed there were used. And it was fascinating working with people from so many different athletic disciplines and finding out which kind of sports psychology techniques work in some areas, which don't in others, and then translating some of what I'd learned there into esports as well. I hope that kind of answered. I do apologize, I ranted a little bit there.
No, it's good. The only downside is there's now like 6 different things that I want to ask, and we can only ask
that's
them
fine.
one by one.
No, of course.
Okay, so the first thing that I would say is, do you see your role then as more supportive and well-being, or more enhancing performance, or does it completely depend on the person? Some people, don't need the well-being side, but they do need the the performance side of things, because well-being is of course incredibly important, but the performance side is really exciting, at least from my point of
Yeah.
view as a coach. Like, of course I want my players to have their well-being sort of taken care of and to be able to grow as people and all this kind of thing. But if I'm starting to work with a sports psychologist, I also want to know, what can you do for our performance as well? So how does that kind of split, or is it entirely case by case?
No, of course, it's a really good question, and it's one I come across a lot as well. Because obviously, understandably, most of the people that hire us want that performance, right? They want to be earning the prize funds. They want to be making it to the big tournaments. Absolutely, correctly so. And so a lot of what we do kind of initially, I would say, is based around performance. Is based around enhancing areas that players want to work on, kind of getting those quick wins so you can get that buy-in, so that then we might go on to work on perhaps some of the tougher stuff. There's more long-term things that might take a few sessions to really understand and get to the bottom of, and then maybe create kind of some support around that. But I'd say for me personally, I think performance and well-being are so interlinked that it would be hard for me to kind of just work on one or the other. I think I would very much struggle if someone came to me and asked, we want you to help our performance, but that's it. Because I would say, well, that's not how I work. It's a philosophy kind of thing. I think with me, my philosophy of working is that the human behind the performer is just as important as the performer, because again, things like burnout, if you've got a positive life outside of the game, I'm a firm believer that that's going to be brought somewhat inside of the game and help you cope when things are tougher, and help you thrive when things are going well. But I would say, yeah, early days, it's probably a lot more performance based, and then, starting to work on the well-being. The one way I tend to sell the well-being side to teams a lot, or at least, work with them on acknowledging it, is, in terms of investment, right? If you've got a player that you've invested a lot of money into and time, and then you're aware that within 6 months they want to leave because they're burned out and they can't handle it anymore, that's not for a team probably a good investment. Whereas if we can support that player, make them feel, supported in terms of well-being and managing that kind of extra load, that workload they might have, the extra pressures they might have on their shoulders, they might want to stay with you for much longer. And that's kind of the way I would sell it to the more business oriented side of organizations that might want to bring me in. But yeah, definitely on a personal level, performance is, fascinating. It's exciting. I love that initially, but then it tends to drift into more of a balance, more of a, I would say it starts out maybe 80-20 and then drifts into more of a 60-40, maybe sometimes 50-50, depending on who you work with. And you're right, it's different for everyone. Some people might come to you just wanting to work on, well-being and life outside the game. But most, I guess, in my experience when entering a team, it is performance first and foremost. And then we start to recognize the importance of well-being within that, if that makes sense.
And I mean, I guess starting with performance can also give you a benefit in terms of, I don't really want to call it buy-in, but getting the player on board, because to talk about this wellness stuff with someone, especially in a high pressure environment like an esports team, you do have to be a bit vulnerable. And if you're talking with someone that you're just meeting and they want to go straight to the wellness stuff, maybe you can be a bit holding yourself back, whereas if it's like, right, this guy really helped me get over some of my nerves or build up a good habit in something else that helped me a lot, and you can start to see the value, then maybe people are a bit more open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that tends to be what I found, because if you put yourself kind of in the shoes of these performers, these athletes, these esports players, their day to day is spent talking about performance, more often than not. It's obviously not true for everyone, but I would argue that most esports performers or athletes tend to talk about performance, wins, what they're doing in their sport, rather than how they're feeling about those performances or wins and the stuff behind it. It's often not shared as much. So yeah, you want to go in, usually for me at least, on common ground. We all share the desire to perform better, kind of work through that. And then, yeah, once you've worked through that and they can see actually this stuff does matter, then you can start to talk around, if they're not bringing it to you already, start to talk around how important well-being is in those performances that they've given, how they feel in general. And I think that's one of the probably more understated areas that a sports psychologist can really benefit a team. It's more implicit than it is explicit, I would say, is just being there for someone who's slightly outside the organization to talk to, having someone that sees everything from an external perspective, isn't involved in the selection processes, isn't involved in perhaps the day-to-day politics of the organization itself, but someone they can just go vent to, and they know that it's not going to impact their future chances at certain things, et cetera, et cetera. And kind of having that security and that I guess, reassurance that that sports psychologist is there for you first and foremost, and for your support and improvement. I think has helped a lot of people, at least that I've worked with, to feel comfortable kind of talking about well-being, talking about mental well-being as well.
I think something that's really important that I always emphasize coaches to have is that, of course, absolutely, you should get to know all your players as well as you can as people, not just as performers, but also as a staff to kind of provide as many different options as possible. So, I mean, someone like you've obviously got a lot more experience than most, or me, for example, at getting people to kind of open up and start to work on this kind of thing. But the first thing that you can do if you're listening to this and you're worried about your players, or you're even just interested in what else could be done, giving multiple different options is always useful. So it's like, okay, they can come to you, they can come to the manager, they can come to this other person. And then, like you said, that's where also having this person who's from the outside, where if we're working on the same team, they can't talk to me about certain things, or they probably can, but they don't know that, and they wouldn't feel like they can. If they've got a problem with the way that I'm doing something, I'm putting too much stress on them, too much pressure on them, it's sometimes completely impossible to go to your coach and say, like, you need to chill out with me a bit, but having someone from the outside can be really, really beneficial. So definitely I would encourage anyone listening to this, give as many avenues as possible, but that outside source is kind of an extra benefit even.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can provide a huge, I think, space for players as well to feel not so alone sometimes in what they're doing, or feel so kind of enclosed by others. Having someone outside of that box is really kind of useful to, I guess, help feel that there is extra support, but also that a lot of what they're going through can be normalized because it's not spoken about enough. A lot of the feelings that esports players, pros might have, most other pros have probably felt that at some point as well, but we don't tend to open up about that or talk about that. So having someone outside that can reassure people sometimes can be huge. And a lot of kind of the work that a sports psych may do, obviously I'm speaking on behalf of my own experience, but I know other sports psychs tend to as well, is we work through the coaches a lot as well. So sometimes, we might have players that are very happy to come to us and chat about well-being. Sometimes we have players who have a much better relationship with the coach who prefer to talk to them about it. And the coach might come to us and say, look, this player is talking to me about some real thing. I can't give advice on it. I'm not qualified. I don't know what to say. Like, what should I do here? And then that's where we might work with the coach to talk about, right, here are some, potential ways that you could make a space for them that's very comfortable to open up. Here are your next steps. If they've mentioned anything that might be, something outside your wheelhouse, here's who you need to contact, etc., etc. So it also provides that, I think, extra layer of comfort to coaches when you might get into those conversations, which do happen. They do happen frequently with players where you might feel a bit out of your depth. They've opened up to you on something and you'll be, perhaps a little bit nervous about how do I answer this? What do I do? How do I show them that I care without them worrying, about impacting, our working relationship in future? So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I used to, back in the day when there was kind of no budget for any of this kind of stuff, and also less people like yourself who are actually qualified to do it, I used to have a sort of similar role on a few teams, and I would have a conversation with each player kind of a few times a month, but trying to be once a week. And I always used to say, like, it's the toughest hour of my week or hour of my day, but also I think it can be the most valuable. But for me, it used to just be completely exhausting. And to be honest, I think it should have been more exhausting for me than it was. Like, now I'm a bit older, this is sort of 5+ years ago, I would take it more seriously even than I took it. And I took it very seriously because it is incredibly important. Obviously speaking to people like yourself, and my brother has actually just finished his training to be a psychotherapist. Like,
amazing.
You end up getting to some incredible things that I didn't think I would be having conversations with people about. We're in at the time, a house in Reading, and end up like never actually sort of cried in a session in front of a player, but like that kind of thing. You talk about really, really serious things. And I remember even a few times coming outside in tour and calling you and Watson, being like, I don't know what to do about this situation, or like something that's just way beyond my it's like way beyond my capabilities, or and I think it is right in a way to be almost afraid of saying the wrong thing, because I think when I see people who are incredibly confident in those situations, unless they put a huge amount of time in, I'm always a little bit worried because, of course, what works for you is not going to work for someone else. We have a real tendency, rather than even listening properly, we have a real tendency to just instantly apply that to our own life and be like, this is what helped me with stress, or this is what helped me with that thing that you're going through, before they've even finished telling you about what it really is. And you might not be actually talking about the real issue. You might be talking about something that's kind of on the surface and all that kind of thing. It becomes, it can become very complicated, but that's why I think having more and more people like yourself is just good, even if it's like someone for the coach to call and say, what do I do in this situation?
Well, absolutely. It's such a challenging job being a coach, that there are many, many pressures. You're often very alone out there on an island as well, even more so than the players, because players often see you as, a slightly different part of the organization. You're not one of them, but you're not, staff of the org in a separate way, in organizational stuff. You're a coach for them. So you walk this weird middle ground between, being a player, being a member of staff, and then, where's your support? The players can talk to each other sometimes, and coaches, this is where I always encourage coaches to have a peer support group or a network of other coaches where you can share these ideas with, which is easier said than done, I know, because often people don't want to share their secrets, share too much. You have to have a real trusting relationship with other coaches. But yeah, that can be a huge help. But what you mentioned about kind of talking with people, it's really challenging. I think you're right. We need to be aware that first and foremost we're there to listen and understand. And then once we listen and understand, then we can start to talk about, well, what might you want to try? What might work for one person? Obviously, like you say, it doesn't work for someone else. And I think we do run this risk of very clear-cut decisions that are this or that, where the reality is it's often, shades of gray in between. It's very rarely just this or that. It's often a case of, let's try something in between that might work for you. Let's see if it works and let's review. And I think, yeah, if people are extremely confident, that often for me as well puts me on the back foot, because it's often way more complex than perhaps it's being presented as. And that's not to say people who are confident around these things might be wrong, not at all. They could be right for sure in each of these settings, but it sometimes just gives across the message that it's quite simple. That's easy, just do this or just do that. Where the reality for many is somewhere in between and can take some time. So again, yeah, having that support of a sports psych, if a team can afford it. I know it is almost a luxury, unfortunately, still in esports, but if you can afford it, if they can get that support, it's worth every penny in my book. But again, of course, I'm a little biased, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a pretty biased conversation because
Yes.
that's exactly what I'm doing. Talking with coaches and trying to give them support. So,
For sure.
of course, I'm going to be quite pro it, considering that's what I'm trying to do with my life. The other thing, though, that I think is worth touching on is just often we're there to listen. Is what you said. I think that is so important. And again, just dragging an example from, I was about to say real life, like the rest of my life. My mum's actually started, she was a school worker for a long time, but she started this project recently where I've forgotten, they even might just call it, it's just listening or something, where I think it's a charity or an organization or something like that, where they just go into schools and they just listen to the kids. You just sit down and for 20 minutes or whatever it is, you just sit there and basically quietly listen to a child. And it's just so effective and important. And the response is kind of amazing because really so many of us are struggling, and so many of us don't really have someone who's like genuinely been there to listen. And so even just doing that, talking about actionable advice you can take from hearing this conversation is, yes, if you have a sports psych, that's great. Constantly ask them for advice. But if you don't, just being there to listen to your players is so important, and finding moments where it's not about teaching them anything. They do feel actually, or will start to feel safe in terms of willing to be like vulnerable and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think on the back of what you say there, I think it's really important. It's a skill. Listening is a skill. It takes time to develop. There are many courses out there on active listening. I encourage any coach that wants to become a good listener to take a course on active listening and learn, what that might look like, especially at esports, because it's much harder when you might not be there in person together. It's much tougher to show you're actively listening when, you could have anything on the screen in front of you. You might not even have your webcam on. How does someone know you're really actively listening to what they're saying, in a moment of vulnerability? So 100% agree with the importance of of listening there. And I think as well, to kind of go alongside that, I think if we work with players and we're always giving advice, that's great because advice can be useful. But have we ever asked the player sometimes what they want? Do they want a solution? Do they want advice, or do they want to be listened to? Because often, I've in my early days when I was a trainee, I've made this mistake of jumping in immediately where someone says, I've got this problem, this is really challenging, and instantly I'm jumping in with, oh, we could do this, we could try this technique. What if we created a plan doing this? And then by the end of it, they're feeling a bit alienated because I didn't really listen. I didn't sit and wait and listen. And sometimes you'll find active listening can be enough to solve the problem. By the end of it, often, my clients, the people I work with, tend to say, actually, I've worked it out. By the end of explaining it, getting someone else's opinion on it, they're like, oh, actually, I'm going to do this. They didn't even need my help. They just needed someone to talk to, hear from an external perspective. So that's one thing as well I would advise any coach who kind of wants to be a good listener to do, is notice when you might jump in with a solution before one has been kind of asked for. And it's very natural to do that. That's what coaching is about. Teaching is about that kind of solution focused work, trying to find ways around problems. But also sometimes we need to ask, is that what people want in the moment? Or do they actually just need to vent a little bit first? And then maybe we give a solution if it's really that big of an issue down the line.
Yeah, and especially when it's an uncomfortable conversation, but absolutely no blame on coaches or managers or whoever for jumping in and trying to help as soon as possible, because sometimes listening is like the hardest thing to do. And again, if you take this example with my mum, they did a bunch of training on it, and the big part of the training was like, you do not give them advice. You will want to. In some of these sessions, you will be internally begging to give them advice. Don't do it. You're there to listen. And it's really, really, really tough. There's so many different things that are our natural response in those kind of situations, and coming from a good place as well. You want to help. So you're trying to help like as quick as you can.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think for me, one of the toughest things, or the toughest skill I had to develop around active listening, was my comfort in silence, and just silence. If I ask a question, often they can be quite hard questions to know the answer to instantly. They take a moment to think about, and when you're face to face with someone, it can get awkward very quickly when you're both just sat in dead silence. And I used to really struggle with that, and I found silence to actually, the more and more I got comfortable with it, the more and more it became a really useful tool for helping people just talk and keep talking, because obviously people want to fill that silence. I wanted to when I was the instigator of the silence. But if you can stay silent and let people just fill that space, often they will then start to, like a snowball, pick up and then start to explain these things. You don't have to jump in. I found myself in the early days jumping in with a suggestion of like, oh, do you mean this, when they went silent? And then they'd be like, yeah, but they might not have actually meant that. They might have just agreed because they didn't come to the conclusion in time and wanted to just agree. So yeah, alongside what you said there, I think another skill massively is comfort in silence.
Yeah, and you latch on to something that's good enough, and even they internally think that is right, but it wouldn't have been what's come out. It's really interesting. I've done these kind of courses as well. I think they can, like you said, I think they're incredibly helpful. But one of the things that I really love doing about this podcast, and actually about just talking with coaches, is that we tend to draw on things from all over the place, sometimes without realizing, and sometimes it was there the whole time and we never did it. And one of the things my background is in, other than coaching, is in making films, and more specifically documentaries. And you can see this so much when you're interviewing someone for a documentary. And even some of the greatest documentaries of all time are almost built entirely on this premise. There's one called, one of the first Errol Morris movies I think it's called Heaven's Gate. That might be wrong. Suddenly doubting myself. I was completely sure of it until I started that sentence. But it's about people at a pet cemetery. But of course, it's not about that at all. It's about all the other things that happen. And I was noticing as I was making these films that really, actually, all the stuff that makes it into the edit is the stuff when there's a pause, or I ask a question, then they talk for like 2 minutes on the question. They answer almost straight away, often because you're talking to someone who has a story, and maybe they've told that story to a bunch of people, either a bunch of different sort of news articles or a bunch of people, all their friends they've told, and they tell you the story and it's quite well prepared, and then there's a bit of a pause. And I used to jump in with the next question, and then I started to just leave it. And you notice that all the things that go into the edit are after the pause. You know, the first part is fine. Sometimes it goes in to just explain what happened. But when it's a really good interview and you come away thinking like, I've done that well, it's almost always where there's a moment where you start to get deeper.
Yeah.
So one of the other, I mean, I do want, I do think this is an important conversation to have, but I do want people to come away with,
of course,
as many kind of tips as possible. So you mentioned then being comfortable with silence and learning to be comfortable with silence, which is no mean feat. But how else would you recommend people get better at active listening?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's a tough one in esports. I would always recommend when in meetings that are important, that are, about more than just a quick here or there, here's some quick advice, have those webcams on, let people know that you are paying attention, that you're physically present if you're not, at a boot camp or if you're not at a facility with your players. It can always help just to have those on. You don't have to have them on all the time. I know that doesn't work for some teams, that's understandable, but just seeing people's eyes and that they're not, looking down at their phone or that they're not off to their second monitor, seeing that they're paying attention can make a real difference. I think another thing I've recommended in the past with coaches, especially new coaches to a team, is start to use players' proper names. And when I say proper names, I mean as in their like names outside of esports, not their display names as such. Use their personal names if they're comfortable with you using that, because it can help kind of build that extra bond a little bit quicker, that you're not just seeing them as their player character or as their performance persona as such. They are a human as well, and you see that human behind that performer, and that is always something that I would recommend, especially with newer coaches coming into these teams once they're building that rapport and that relationship, to absolutely do that. But if you're in person, make time for those in between moments. It's something that it seems so obvious when you mention it, but until you start doing it, if you're in person, make time where you're not always on task, always doing something, time where you can bump into the players and just have a chat. Maybe you could walk to get a takeaway together or get a coffee or something. Just make that time where you can pop somewhere, have that 5 to 10 minute chat. They might say, actually, I'm feeling exhausted today, I really struggled today. But if we don't have those times in between, and it can be hard because sometimes nothing can happen in those times in between, we can't force it to happen, but if we don't have them, we can't always develop that kind of rapport, that closeness, and that kind of, I guess, meaning and understanding from players that you are there to listen and care about them more as just something that creates performance and gets the wins for us.
One thing that kind of reminded me of is there was a story, Steve Jobs, when he first took over Pixar. So Pixar, the studio that makes, Toy Story onwards, one of the best animation studios in the world. And Steve Jobs, obviously famous for being at least an effective, leader. I'm sure there's problems with it, but still incredibly effective. He wanted to redesign their offices, and they've got 1,000, 2,000 employees. He wanted to redesign the offices to have one toilet by the front. So, not one toilet as in literally one toilet, but one block of toilets. So everyone had to go to the same place. And you've got thousands of people, so some of them had to go quite far. But his reasoning was for that exact point. People will run into each other when they're both just going to the same place, and you'll get these little conversations and these little sparks where stuff can happen that you would never get in any other situation. Now, they didn't end up doing it, and that's definitely too extreme, but still an important thing to consider. Like, do allow for little moments of connection or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah. And if you're online, how do you manufacture time for those moments of connection? It's very something that does need to be thought on sometimes, because it's not as natural as when you're in person. Like you say, you can bump into each other, go get a croissant or something together, whatever it is. But when you're online, you can't necessarily do that. So how do you create those times? Do you let the players know that you're going to start initially maybe some formal social sessions where you bring everyone together and we play a social game, and then that eases off into informal, and then hopefully from that you've got a relationship where you can just play some games. Maybe you find out they enjoy playing different games together, and lo and behold, you also play those games. Maybe you can jump in every now and then and play, or maybe you just have, a small open door hour every week where anyone can jump in, have a chat. You can just chill out in the Discord call, in TeamSpeak, whatever it is. But it does take, I think, a bit more thought when you're online to kind of how do you get those spark moments, those moments where you're on the way to the office kitchen, let's say, to make a coffee, and then you chat about, what's been going on in general and get to learn a bit more about your players. So when those things aren't natural in the environment, some thought has to be put into how do we develop those and how do we create those. So extreme example, I suppose, from Steve Jobs, but absolutely, I agree with the idea of those spark moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the biggest problems, I think, of being online, if not the biggest problem. I think scrimming online is actually maybe not as good, but I think actually the biggest gap is those small moments that bring the team together as well as bring you closer to the team as a coach. And I always say, look, there are some teams, especially with the way esports is run, especially when we're talking about ridiculously short timelines, that actually are better online because everyone's comfortable at home. What tends to happen when you bring people together is this like dip in performance and then going back up, which is why it still baffles me a lot that so many people in League of Legends, for example, boot camp before a playoffs or something, where we're going to play playoffs from a different location than we've been playing the entire year, which is always an interesting one. But yeah, when you're online, suddenly it's like, now we have to actually book a time to have a little chat or something, or you don't get to just run into people. And it's something that I've really struggled with in teams that I've coached in the past. And I felt like if we were in person, I would have been able to have a much bigger impact and therefore would have been able to fix certain problems that we just couldn't fix. So it's really not something that I have the answer to. I think I've never tried it, but the thing that I do with my clients, which I would try with a team if I was to ever go back into teamwork again, which I'm not sure I will, is at the end of the day, I have to make a small reflection on the day and just leave me a voice note, and we can just do little voice notes back and forward, which of course is absolutely planned and absolutely sort of scheduled, but can still provide you some of that moments of just hearing sort of what's going on and how they felt about it rather than just what was there. But there's, really, I don't have a good answer as to how we can kind of combat this problem. And even being aware of it, I think, is the first step, where people see, when we're all in person, we get to have VOD review round a big screen, and that's the big benefit. And I would say it's the tiny moments that you don't notice. That's where we're getting all the value.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100% agree. I think we're one of the teams I've worked with in the past that the most rewarding moments don't come in the formal sessions where I'm doing like an hour session or a workshop on something. It's in the in-betweens where we go off, we grab some lunch together, we come back and we sit down and we just chat, and they realize, if they haven't met me before, that I'm more than just, a psychologist. I'm not just an academic. I'm a practical psychologist. I've been out in the field. Oh, I also play games. Oh, I also play CS or Rocket League. And, we won't talk about my rank. That's irrelevant. But I also enjoy those things that they do. And then people start to see the real you behind what you do. And that can help as well with buying. And it's the same for coaches. If they can see that you're a real person with their best interests at heart, sometimes that buying can really come through. But I agree.
One thing I wanted to do, you mentioned that you often start with some sort of performance gains to try and, just better for the teams often, or maybe not better, but what they want for the teams. And it can give you something to then base some things off. So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is go through a few different problems that I've seen from esports that are like just really common, come back all the time. And we go through maybe, well, if you've got solutions for them, share them. But I'm expecting it to be more like, this is a starting point. This is how I'd start out on this problem. And then we can, again, give some people some actionable advice of things to try.
Yeah. Okay. God, grilling me here. Okay. I'm ready. Right.
So the first one starts off, maybe a bit easier. Not easier because of the topic, but easier because you've written about this. And everyone should, of course, go and read that for sure. But how to beat tilt.
Yes, that's a classic. Yeah, I do get asked about this frequently, understandably, because it's one of the biggest, I think, challenges that a lot of players face. I think it's something everyone faces, and I will preface this by saying I'm not perfect as well. Sometimes I will feel tilted. It's something that happens. It's the nature of the games we play, and it's the nature of us as humans, how we respond to it. But what matters is how we work through that, and the behaviors we engage with after tilt. So I guess some of the first kind of ports of call, if I was working with someone that came to me and asked about, how do I beat tilt, is I suppose getting to the bottom of, well, what tilts you, what actually frustrates you. Because for some people, it's themselves. If they miss a shot, that can be the most frustrating thing in the world because they expect perfection from themselves. Maybe they don't acknowledge that they can make mistakes, because they want perfection. That's one way. For others, it's, I was playing really well finally, but my whole team was terrible. That's a very common one, is, well, the other team, especially in solo queue, if you think about League of Legends, the impact that one player can even have on a game alone, even if you've got 4 good players, can still really change kind of the game and the way it's played. So for some people, that's kind of the core of tilt. And there are other reasons as well. So I would say the first port of call is self-awareness, and working on that with players is, sometimes challenging because, instantly people want to hear, no, just do this. This will fix it. And there are things, that can help. But again, one of the first and most important things is that self-awareness of, well, what really tilts you, what frustrates you, and why does that frustrate you? Why does it frustrate you that you miss shots? Is it because, you have some signs of perfectionism? Okay, if we know that, then we can start work on the perfectionism side of things and go into that. If it's about kind of team and your attitude towards your teammates, then we can focus on maybe a technique around controlling the controllables, right? You can't control your teammates if you're in solo queue, but you can control what you do with that, and kind of the mindset around sometimes seeing these things which could be frustrating as a bit of a challenge. If you're basically playing 4v5 because someone on your team is griefing and so on, that's an opportunity to learn how to play whilst disadvantaged, right? It's an opportunity where in a game someone might be quite ill. You might have a sub standing in that's not of the same standard as your usual teammate, but oh look, you've actually trained with that. Rather than being tilted, sometimes you've seen it as an opportunity to train with someone playing worse. So things around kind of working on the mindset, I would often recommend but first you've got to know the mindset, and that's where those initial questions come in. In terms of more practical things, of course, breathing exercises are a huge one. I think they're very, very common out there. A lot of people engage in breathing exercises, but I would say the one thing I would make sure with working with individuals is that it works for that person. Breathing exercises don't work for everyone. It's not a one size fits all kind of method, but it can help, in those moments where people are kind of getting a bit tilted, a bit frustrated about things. Sometimes just taking a moment, take that deep breath. And, one of the things I always encourage is to notice where you're breathing from. A lot of us breathe with our chest. Our chest goes up and down. But what we really want to do is belly breathing, which is where you breathe with your diaphragm. You pull the air in, almost like, have you seen in those old school fireplaces, you have those bellows where you can push them and pull them out? It's like that, or like an accordion, I like to say. Imagine you've got an accordion where your rib cage stops at the bottom and you're sucking the air in, and you want your belly to be pushing out as you're bringing that air in, and then you want to push the air out using your ab muscles rather than your chest, which we naturally do, especially when we're sat down. We tend to squish our diaphragm a little bit as well. So some of those deep breathing exercises, belly breathing, in those moments when you can. So in League of Legends, I often recommend taking a moment once you've died. It can be the most frustrating time, but you've got some time there. You can either spend that time being frustrated and angry, or you can spend that time trying to bring yourself back to, where you perform well, which is when you're calmer. Those are just some kind of brief early tips. Obviously, a lot of where tilt comes from tends to stem from deeper, more mindset orientated areas. So the way we think about the world, the voice we're using in our head, the way we explain situations to ourselves. So in the long term, we'd look at probably working with players to help manage their outlook on these events and change the outlook of these events and so on. Because one of the biggest kind of things or I guess foundations of my philosophy kind of stems around the idea that it's not the events themselves that disturb us, it's our perception of these events. It's what we tell ourselves about these events. So just like I said earlier, that kind of mindset, if we've got a challenge mindset of, well, actually, it's not actually that bad because it's an opportunity for me to grow. If you've got that mindset, you're probably going to be less tilted than someone who thinks, oh, I can't believe this only had time for one game tonight and they've ruined it. They've ruined everything. Probably going to be more tilted than that. So I appreciate it's probably not the most usable tips and techniques that I've given there, but it gives you a window into what we do as sports psychologists to understand the groundwork and kind of progress through that. But yeah, I'd say good ports of call are understanding what frustrates you, why it does, managing your mindset. And maybe, you know, some of the simple things that you can do with that is writing down key phrases on a post-it note. That's what I like to do, and I'll stick it to the bottom right hand corner of my monitor. It's great for League of Legends because every time you look at your map, you're going to see your post-it note right down there, or wherever you have your map on your screen. I suppose you can change it, but yeah, just some practical tips there to add on at the end.
I think it's really good. I think one of the things you said there on perception, I think that's just so important even for life. Like it's not just the voice that's in your head, but that there's that phrase, I can't remember who said it, but it's like something like this: the worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And it could be that compared to someone else, that's like really trivial, but that doesn't mean it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to you.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, you know, it's been very interesting doing a lot of traveling in the last few years and going to places that I wouldn't normally go to, and seeing the kind of problems that people have to deal with. In a way, it does make you think that the stuff that we deal with in the UK or in France is just so trivial, and it's like, why is this a big problem? But then on the other hand, it's like, it's still, it's the biggest problem that we've got for us. And yes, we're in a super privileged position to be in that state, but your perception is your reality. And it doesn't matter if you're finally a professional player in the game that you've loved for ages on your favorite team, and you've got, you know, loads of fans or whatever. I mean, you can look at things that are happening with KC, you know, they're trying to be here for so long, trying to be at the top level. They've absolutely more than earned the spot there, and suddenly it's all not working. And in a sense, you can say, well, you're playing for maybe a boyhood club and it should be the best situation ever, but you have no idea what's going on inside people's heads, because actually we live in our heads. We don't live outside in the world. So I think it's a really important thing to bear in mind. Yeah,
it's fascinating what you say there around kind of how what's hardest for you is hardest for you, no matter your yardstick. You know, I used to have a kind of metaphor I'd use in sessions sometimes when they would often say, I'm feeling really stressed about this, and then they would say, oh, but it's really silly because I know people have it harder. And the fact people have it harder is good to acknowledge, good to understand, for sure, to understand where your privilege lies, absolutely, but it doesn't make that any less hard for you. You know, I liken it to having you've got a yardstick here. This is your yardstick. Someone else's yardstick might be that big, but the end of your yardstick is still the end of your yardstick, even if it's shorter than someone else's, even though a yard is a yard. You know what I mean? You know, we can have a yard 0.5, whatever. But that kind of metaphor, I think, helps explain kind of this mindset around, you know, often we will, you know, self-down or shame ourselves for feeling a certain way because someone else has it worse, which absolutely they do, and we're very lucky, and we should acknowledge how lucky we are. But it doesn't necessarily change the fact that what we feel is what we feel, and that's where our perception, if we can work on changing our perception and that inner voice, that might start to change it, you know. And one of the things I think I've had a few breakthrough sessions with clients is where talking with them, you've explored their self-talk, what they tell themselves, how they speak to themselves in their head, and it's the moment of realization when, you know, they realize, oh, actually, I don't have to listen to what that voice says. I don't have to listen to that voice saying, oh, I should be really nervous, or I'm actually a really bad player. Well, why do I listen to that? Why do I believe that when that might not actually be true? And that is a moment usually of the start of a really big change or journey for those individuals where they can start to kind of actually change that voice or learn to not listen to it and listen to a more positive voice instead. And I love those moments. But fully agree with your idea, apart from my terrible metaphor, which, you know, to me makes sense. But as I said, I was like, that technically a yard is a yard. But yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't actually that had me laughing a bit, is that I will have to explain a yard is a unit of length. It's a measurement.
Oh yes.
This generation and also not English people will not understand that at all.
Well, let's say meter.
Meter. There you go.
Yeah, that's probably more appropriate.
Yeah, just our old systems. Okay, one. You know, bringing it back to slightly more practical for a second. You mentioned breathing exercises before. You mentioned focusing on where your breathing is coming from. But then you sort of, I think, brushed over some things which I think are very important. So you say from there, like deep breathing exercises. So what exactly do you mean by that? Is it an in and out timing? If so, what are the different options? Like what do you mean other than, so I'm paying attention, I'm breathing from my belly and I'm pushing the air out with my with my abs, but then also what are some other things to consider?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And there are so many breathing exercises out there, so many different ones that have been well researched for different reasons. But the best for me and my memory, because it's just so simple to remember, is the 4x4 method. That's what I kind of go back to as it's more of a means to an end to get people to notice themselves, how they feel, the tension in their body again, and come back to it. So the 4x4 method would be you would breathe for 4 seconds in, you'd hold it for 4, out for 4, and pause for 4. And it's not a very natural breathing method. You know, we don't often breathe in 4 seconds like this and that. But the idea is it's getting you to pay attention to this control of that breath. And if you're doing it with your diaphragm rather than your chest, you should start to feel a little bit in that moment calmer, usually a bit more aware of your surroundings, how you feel. Often after doing 4 sets of that, which is what I generally encourage, 4x4, people would start to realize, actually, I'm quite tense, you know. And that's one of another practical thing I often say to people who work in esports or our performers is notice how tense your body is, how much tension you're carrying. And if you're in a best of 3, you know, you don't often realize how tense you are until the end of the match and you're exhausted, and then you've got to get up and do it again for the next match, especially in league when matches can be like 40 odd minutes plus, and so on, and same in CSGO. But if you're in between those matches, taking a moment, having a breather, maybe even when you've died at the fountain, you can kind of ease that tension out of you again. And one thing I always remind people is tension up to a level is fine. You know, you need to be tense, you need to be ready to perform. But if you think about how much fine motor skill you need, so how much skill you need around small movements of the mouse, small movements of clicking, you know, knowing what to click on your buttons, etc. The more tense you are, the less and less control you have over these fine grade movements. You know, if you tense your arm really strong now and try and open your hands and close them, you know, it's probably quite juddery because you're really tense. Your muscles are so tense. But if you're nice and loose, you can open and close them quite smoothly and calmly. And this is the kind of analogy I like to remind players of, and I often encourage them in between matches to get up, stretch it out, you know, roll the shoulders back, do some deep breathing, because you're letting that tension go again, and you're gaining some of that fine motor control back. Because in those clutch moments where it's 1v1 and, you know, you're going for the nexus, whatever it is, you can get really tense, and that might be the difference between hitting your shot or not, you know, hitting that cue or not.
Yeah, I think it's really, really useful, and definitely something that people should experiment with. I mean, you did mention at the beginning, you know, it's we were talking about how to beat tilt originally.
Oh, yes.
You mentioned that it's different per person and finding what works for you and that sort of thing. But an example that always stuck with me and I really wanted to do in League of Legends, but haven't managed, at least at this stage, was someone was telling me they worked with the England cricket team and they set up a thing for the bowlers where they had a heart rate monitor and a watch to just tell them their heart rate. And they would do a bowl. I don't know the terminology. I've never been interested in cricket, so sorry if that's not how you're supposed to say it. But they would do a bowl, and if it went badly or even if it went well, as they're walking back to go again, they'd look at the watch, and they would just have very, very specific tools and protocols that wasn't about if you feel stressed or if you feel tilted. It was like, right, if the numbers are above this, you do this. If the numbers are below this, you do this. And it just supposedly took so much of the guesswork is the wrong way to say it, but it was like, okay, it doesn't matter if you feel tilted or if you feel upset or if you think, because then we start to get into this thing of like, oh, I shouldn't feel like this. I should just get myself out of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, that's great, but you can't do it and then it can make it worse. So it was just right. If it's over this number, you do this type of breathing exercise. And League of Legends does have so many moments where we get pauses, whether you're dying or resetting and you're about to just open on the map before you decide when you're opening. Like, if we could have a little thing to just check how my, you know, touch base with how I'm doing. So if you don't have a specific system for that, of course you have to just do it internally, but I think that can be incredibly useful.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the key is routine as well, right? You know, I know, you know, performance coaches that work with big teams, mental coaches as well, that kind of swear by the idea that whether they have a good game or not, they will still do their breathing exercises beforehand, you know, because you're getting yourself in that mindset that it's just something you do. It helps you regardless of whether you win or not. It's not based on externals, it's based on internals and your own patterns. So yeah, 100% agree.
Great. Okay. So that's the first one. The next one, that's another big one. How to give feedback. I'll leave it as open-ended as that.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I guess it's, again, depends on the team you're working with, depends on the rapport you have, the relationship. I think feedback is a fascinating thing overall. Constructive feedback is key, obviously, in terms of improvement and so on. But again, like we talked about earlier, I'm a real proponent of positive feedback as well, of strengths and so on. And there are many different methods. I know a very well-known method is the sandwich method, where you will sandwich a bit of constructive criticism, perhaps, or feedback inside two lovely positive things. That's one method people can do. It's successful in its own way. There are other methods as well that I'm very keen on, especially for coaches who might not be familiar with the team. Having a framework they can use is usually helpful. One such framework I like to use is the BET and the BEAR model. And BET is for more positive impacts that you see individuals having on their team, and that's behavior, effect, thanks. So what you're doing is you're noticing the behavior that a player's done, the effect it's had on themselves and the team, and then you're thanking them for it. Very simple, but if you like that structure as a coach, that sort of thing can be very useful. And then the other side of that is more for the constructive giving feedback, which is the BEAR model. So that's behavior, effect, alternative, and result. And this is something that I often work with coaches through is, if they're seeing a behavior that they think is detrimental to the team, they will raise that, in a private or team setting. They will talk about the effect that's actually having on the team. So there's a rationale behind why they're raising it. They're not just raising it to have a go at you. They're actually raising it because they think it has an impact or they've seen something. Then there will be an alternative suggested. So, actually it'd be great if instead of doing this, you could do this, and here's how you can do this, that support. And then there will be a result of, if one, the alternative is completed, like if you actually manage to do this is really going to help the team, I'll be really impressed and we won't have to chat again. But if it doesn't get reached, then that's when, maybe that tougher decision of what is the result of if you don't do this. If you don't do this, we're probably going to have to talk again about it, and go through it. And then, the steps that you have to take internally as a team, that's, up to the team themselves. But they're kind of the more formalized ways. I think that individuals, coaches, if you do find it hard sometimes just to naturally give feedback and feel comfortable doing that, sticking to some of these frameworks can be really useful. But one of the biggest general rules I would say is we do fall into this trap of highlighting what went wrong, why we lost games, but rarely, at least in my experience, and it could just be a personal thing, rarely highlighting why we won games. Why did we win this? Was it just because the other team made loads of mistakes? Probably a little bit, but also what did we do really well? How could we be the best in the world? And it kind of, to go back to cricket, like you mentioned earlier, there are, many different specialists in cricket. You've either got the batter specialists, they're great with a bat. You've got the fielder specialist and then the bowler specialists as well. And then you've got people in between. And I guess my question I always ask to players is, if you are brilliant at one thing, why can't we make you the best in the world at it? So let's talk about the strengths. Let's talk about what you do that makes you better than some other people around that. And then how do we make you the best? Because that can sometimes be just as valuable as bringing up the bottom line, bringing up those mistakes. If we can, raise your top end massively as well as bring up that bottom, having a balance of that is key. So I would say, yeah, giving and receiving feedback, those kind of frameworks, something that I'd always encourage people to use if not comfortable just chatting away, but also focusing on the positives, not just because they're positive to make people feel good. It is nice to feel good, but also letting people know there's a real practical reason we're focusing on the positives. It's because that's what often sets us apart as a team. It's not just that we don't make as many mistakes, it's that we make some brilliant plays and so on.
Yeah, I think as well, when you tie that into gameplay and like gameplay feedback, you have to be even more careful. I don't have any of these specific acronyms and stuff like that, but something that I often go through with clients is you have to be careful of the meta point that you're making. Meta being like the abstract point, not about draft. If you have a player or a team who is very creative and very aggressive, let's say a player, but occasionally they go too far and you think, right, I want to stop them going too far, but I want to make sure, they're still very aggressive and still very creative and they're not afraid to take opportunities. So I'm just going to work with them a lot because they're really good and they could be amazing. I'm going to show them here. They've made a few mistakes here. They went a bit too far there. You went a bit too far there. Next game, you went a bit too far here, a bit too far here. The point you're making, whether you want to or not, is to be less aggressive and to not go forward as much. If you say, here's 5 different examples where you engaged when you shouldn't have engaged, then the impression you're giving whether anyone even makes it conscious. The impression you're giving is to be less aggressive, to look for less engages, to second guess yourself before you go in. And that could be the exact opposite of what you really want. But it's just because looking after a game and saying this playing aggressive or this engage was insanely good, or even it went really badly, but I love that you did it. It should have gone well. Like it would go well in most situations, or, you know, that kind of thing. And I think that's really, really important to make sure that you're aware of, both in terms of the in-game, but then also, like you said, in terms of just in general feedback, regardless of what you're talking about, emphasizing strengths, because you can end up dulling those strengths just by focusing on the weaknesses, because quite often they're sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. Yeah, a lot of we actually did recently with one of the teams I worked. We did a strength workshop around, you know, finding out their personal strengths, what they think they are, and it's fascinating how difficult that can be sometimes, because often people aren't told their strengths, and they're very humble. People, generally speaking, they won't come to you with, actually, I'm really good at this, and then so on. But what you say about being sides of the same coin, yeah, often a strength is only a strength when you've got it kind of in the perfect zone. Sometimes it can become a weakness if you overplay that strength. You know, if, like you say, with aggression, right, that makes a player brilliant, potential pop-off player all the time if it's in the middle. But if they overplay aggression, you know, 70% of the time they're just, you know, throwing things away, that becomes a weakness. But if they underplay their aggression and they never do anything with their strength, you know, that's also a weakness. So it is about keeping that strength. I like to think of it as like a speedo, like a speedometer in the middle. You want it at a perfect nice 70. You don't want to be going 120 miles an hour, but you don't want to be going 10 miles an hour, you know, on the motorway. You want to be going at 70, at least in the UK. I'm not sure what it's like in France. But
yeah, well, we don't do miles elsewhere in the
no,
world.
you do kilometers, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think as well, it's very important as a coach to know, or to try and get to the closest approximation of what people's strengths actually are, because they might not be what the people think they are. And also, if you take that speedo example, for some players, it might be that they're best at this level and some players are best more in the middle. Because of course, if you have players, you know, an aggressive player like Kazi, for example, arguably one of, if not the best AD carry in Europe, if you just took him and you made him a little bit less aggressive, and he wouldn't lose his team the game by eing forward on Ezreal, he also wouldn't be the best. He would just be near the middle. You can't get rid of one without the other quite often. So definitely important to keep in mind. One of the other things as well that I wanted to touch on that I think is really important from one of the things you said, this bear way of giving feedback, the alternative thing. I think that's so important. We often talk about respect in a culture, and one of the reasons I want to have these conversations is so often what I see in esports is people kind of coming together, saying a bunch of interesting, nice sounding things, and then going away and acting just the same. So people often say, you know, we want to respect each other, and I always ask, okay, what does that mean? And mostly people actually haven't even taken it to the actual kind of actionable step. And I think giving an alternative when you give feedback is such a good way of showing respect. It's like, I've put the time in myself to come up with an alternative that you could do. So it's not just, you've got to stop playing like this because you're my top laner and you need to not die while we're doing something bot. It's like, here's an actual alternative. Have you considered it, or have you tried it? Obviously, if you're a player talking to another player, you might not be comfortable saying do this, and maybe you shouldn't say do this, but just here's an alternative. And whether you phrase it in a kind of nice way or not, showing them that alternative shows them that you've put the work in yourself. It's not just like a gut instant reaction, just stop doing this thing I don't like. It's like, I've thought actually about why you might do it, and I've thought maybe try this sort of thing, and they're trying to help, and that can frame it in such a better and more productive way.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in doing that, you're showing the individual again that you've got their best interests at heart, which is to win, you know, or to perform well. You know, you're not poking holes in what they do just for the sake of poking holes or to make them look bad, which is often, you know, sometimes something people understandably worry about. But you're actually providing that additional layer of thought, of understanding, of trying to help them get where they need to go. And again, it comes back to being a coach. You're walking alongside these people here and supporting them on their journey to improvement. You're not just there to say this is wrong, but not then provide an idea of what could be right. Or how do I get there? And I think what you mentioned about behaviors and something like respect, I think that is key. There's been many an awkward silence in sessions, in workshops, where we've come up with our goals or we've come up with things we want, and then we get to what I consider the most important thing, which is how do we display these goals? How do we show these in behavior? Behavior is everything, because intentions are great, words are great, thoughts are great, but how do we actually make the physical, tangible things in the world? It's through our behavior. So if we're saying, we're not going to rage at each other, etc., and we're all, hugging each other, high-fiving, and then the first game we get in, people are like huffing and puffing and sighing, that's not our goal, because our behavior is incongruent with our goal. We'll have to go back to the drawing board and work out how do we change this behavior. So having those behaviors and those, like you say, tangible, actionable things, I think are essential in a team. And it's hard because sometimes you really do have to drill down into, well, what does it mean to show respect to each other? What behaviors do we associate with respect, which takes time. But once you've done that, then at least you're clear as a team on when respect is being shown or when it's not. So for one of the simplest things that respect could come under is being on time. Could argue that's respectful behavior. If someone says I respect you, but they're never showing up on time to your sessions, then it calls into question, do they genuinely respect the team and what they're doing? So a bit of a tangent, but I really liked that point you made.
Yeah, just to encourage people to not be happy with the cliche almost of, we want to be a respectful team, we want to be a professional team, and we all want to work hard. Great. That's absolutely great goals to have. But what do those things actually mean? Because they also might mean something different to you than they do to me. And a behavior that I might consider really disrespectful, like the time one, other people might not. So it's really important to just kind of push down through that. I want to push this as well. There's some great advice here about, as a coach, how to give feedback, or even just if you're a player listening to this, how to give feedback as well. But either as a sports psych or as a coach, what do you do in terms of a session with the team, of how the team should give feedback to each other? Do you go for these specific setup systems, or is there other stuff that you do to kind of make that as productive as possible?
It's a good question. I think in group sessions around feedback, one of the first things I do is encourage people to come up with their own examples using these BET, BEAR models, just so people get used to the feeling of what feedback is like. But a lot of what we end up discussing is this idea of giving the feedback, the responsibility on the person giving the feedback, and the responsibility on the person listening to it, and where they align with things like respect, like we say, because there can be an idea that for some people it's all on the listener. They should just know how to take it well, which to some extent it is true. If we have a positive mindset around feedback, we can take feedback that might be said in a fairly harsh, rude way in a good way. But also there is a responsibility on giving the feedback. So a lot of what we talk about is, what do we as a team want from feedback? And it's different for everyone. Some people want it instant, blunt, so they can fix it. Other people, and it's absolutely understandable, would like it a little bit softer, a little bit more, look, I know you didn't mean to do this, absolutely understand that, but next time maybe you could try and do this. And understanding what's different for everyone, I think, is key. So in a group setting, there would be a lot of discussion around, well, what does this team want? And it's a tough one to have, because sometimes people can be influenced by what other people say. They feel like they should be able to just handle any feedback. But the reality is, we are human, we're social animals. We are wired to be sensitive to the opinions of other people. And there's no guilt in that. There's no shame in that. It's just about understanding, well, what as a team would we prefer? And as individuals, if we can remember, well, actually one player wants it really blunt, but the other one would prefer a little bit of a softer approach. If we know that, then that's brilliant, because then, you'll never have trouble with feedback in future. So that's kind of how a group session would look for me around feedback, is using these models just to get people used to it, and then coming to an understanding and clarity, so we're all on the same page, as it were, around what feedback we would like and how we would like it given.
And I think it's a really good point there, to not assume that the way that it's best for you is therefore the way that it's best for everyone else. I mean, I've used this example already on the podcast, so I probably shouldn't do it too many times, but I've married a Ukrainian woman, and even just seeing the way that cultures are across Europe and different sides of Europe feeds so much into how we talk to each other, and therefore how we want to talk to each other, in terms of how direct things are, or how kind of sugar-coated things are, and all that kind of thing. And I think there's not a right way to give feedback, or there's not a right way to receive feedback. It's just each person needs to be treated in this same like individual manner. And I think what you said there is great. Like um, it's not your fault if you want to receive feedback in a certain way,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, yeah, there's no shame in that. We are wired a certain way, evolutionarily speaking, that which protected us, when we were cavemen. It still protects us somewhat to this day, this desire to avoid shame, to avoid feeling like we've done wrong, because that might put us in the out group rather than the in group, etc. That's natural, and you can't beat yourself up about that, because that's kind of just the way humans are. But there are things we can do to manage those feelings and those behaviors that come after those feelings, and that's really the key, and that's what we would do with a team. And what you say about kind of culturally, I think it's so important in esports because of how amazingly easy it can be to play with people from other countries. You have to be culturally aware that what you might think is understandable, a calm way of giving feedback, someone else might think is perhaps quite rude, perhaps not. And we don't know that unless we have these discussions, and it's these assumptions, and we all have our own assumptions and biases, thinking the world is a certain way based on what we understand, that are wrong. And we don't know that though until we find that out. And sometimes if we find that out and it's not discussed, you can go a whole season and have this animosity between players that you don't even know where it came from originally, and it's built up because of other issues that have come from that. Whereas we could have nipped it in the bud by getting a understanding of what we prefer, how we prefer it. So yeah, really, really key point, I think, as well, is that cultural awareness and sensitivity to how other people speak as well. And often I know in esports, in many teams, the kind of default language is English, and that tends to be the second language of a lot of players. So for players talking, translating mentally through different words, sometimes the wrong words are going to be used, sometimes the wrong intonation is going to be used, and those intonations might even mean different things in different cultures as well. So there's so much complexity that sometimes we just have to be able to get on the same level early days, and then carry on from there.
And put the work in early on, and it will save you so much in the future.
Oh yeah.
One of the things I'm not sure, I mean, actually, I'm gonna change this around, because I think maybe the last one is gonna veer us off into non-sports psych territory as well, and maybe slightly less practical, but I do think it's important to talk about. So the next biggest area that I would guess most coaches want their sports psych to just fix for them. So if you could just fix this for all of us, how do we translate scrim or practice performance to stage performance? And we've seen this at all levels. Last year, Vitality in the LEC doing poorly was still supposedly smashing everyone in scrims, even when they were coming last on stage or whatever it was. And the same FlyQuest, supposedly absolutely best team in practice, 10th team on stage, despite the fact that you're obviously still just sitting at a desk playing a game, you could argue. And people still have the same problem. We had the same problem in Slurry, like massively so. And that's when we were online. So you're not even sitting at a different desk. You're not even sitting in front of a crowd, but there is something so different. So obviously you don't actually have to solve it, but how do you start with a problem like this?
It's one of the most fascinating aspects of esports I love. When I talk and do workshops for psychologists that might be outside of the esports realm, it's one of the examples I always come back to of what makes esports unique, is that they can practice, train, play, succeed at home, in comfort of home, where they're only streamed to people online that they can't see. They can't see the eyes of these people, the faces, there are no stage lights. And then how do you translate that performance of a very comfortable area into a very uncomfortable area that they've probably had to fly to a different country, be it a boot camp, do all these things? So it's an extremely complex challenge for coaches, and it really depends on the setup you have. It's obviously probably tougher for those who don't have a boot camp space, and then all of a sudden you're playing on stage. That's a huge leap, especially for semi-pro, pro level players. But it is a real challenge throughout, and I think we can take a lot from traditional sports here, from kind of techniques that have been tried and tested for many, many years. Things like pressure training, where they would basically simulate the environments, or simulation training it's also called. So they would, perhaps as close as possible, recreate what the stage might feel like. And I know that's almost impossible for most teams, but some examples could be setting the computers up in the same way that they would be set up on the stage, and then getting staff, friends and family to come and watch the players in person, That's just one suggestion that I've made in the past, and it sounds kind of like, oh, that's a lot of effort. But sometimes just doing that a couple of times, or giving people that added pressure and nervousness of having people watch them, can make that step in between a little bit easier. You're building an extra rung on the ladder there to get to the next one, rather than going from here right up to here straight away. And it can also let people know, especially if you work with a psychologist, it's great for letting people know how you respond in those moments, and where you are, and if it works really well for you, because some players love that feeling of being on show, being in front of everyone, a chance to prove everything, and other players shy away from that because it can be really nerve-wracking. It's unusual, they're not used to it. And if we can find out that for different members of the team, how they respond, then before the time comes, we can go away and work on those individual strategies around, managing nerves, building confidence, and so on, or hyping yourself up to a level where you need to be hyped up. Because again, our optimal functioning zones are different for everyone, and you've got to find those out. So that's kind of one way I think you could help manage that challenge as a coach, is get things as similar as possible. Maybe play some crowd noises. One thing we did with one of the teams I worked at, our first ever LAN after COVID, in Sweden, it was a Rocket League game. We stood behind the players. We managed to get them playing scrims on the stage area, so they would get used to it, and we stood behind the players and cheered and shouted and tried to distract them, and just saw how they played with that, just to get them used to it, because it was going to happen. And then by the time it came around to having real crowds there, etc., it was almost a bit of a meme, because we'd done that and we joked about it. They were like, oh, it's blah 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 and the coach doing this. So it kind of takes that extra pressure off. So that's what I would say around simulation training, pressure training. Another thing, having some routines, bringing something from home that is your routine, bring that with you. If you've got a pillow that you find comfortable at home, bring that abroad when you go to this tournament, or bring that to wherever you have to go. Have something that ties you back to normality and routines. If you go for a run every morning, as best as you can, try and keep that up when you're abroad. Something that grounds you. Maybe call home every now and then if you're regularly in contact with your family or friends, and so on. Just having those sorts of grounding moments where it brings you back to reality every now and then, lets you know you are still the same person doing your same job, can be very handy. And one of my kind of favorite, I guess, mindsets and ways to look at it, and a metaphor again I tend to use in sessions, is if you think of the 100-meter sprinter, whether they're training or they're at the Olympics, the track does not change. The track is still 100 meters. You've still got your trainers on. You've still got to run and be as quick as possible. So the challenge, if we reduce it down, it's no different. Summoner's Rift is still Summoner's Rift. You're not playing on another map. You're still playing with your teammates. If we can focus in on just that, you've still got your peripherals usually. Then it's not too different from what you're used to. So that, again, that mindset, and all three of those, implement with different timings, etc., etc. There's a lot there to unpack, but that's generally how I would encourage some coaches to go about, supporting their players. Obviously, with, probably I would argue that the consultancy of a sports psychologist, you don't want to push things too far. You don't want to simulate things to the nth degree at all. Just enough to get people familiar with these feelings.
Yeah, I think. Well, I'll touch on each one before I start to ask my follow-ups. But something that I really like and has always stuck with me, there's an MMA coach for us, Sahabi, who used to tell people, don't be the star of your own movie. And the way he said it is just like you were saying at the end there, like, we fight every day in training. You're not scared of the fight, you're scared of the cameras. And he's saying it's basically, don't overthink it. But what we tend to do is we play through scenarios in our head of like, what's it going to be like when we lose, or what's it going to be like when we win? Or if you're on a losing streak, for example, you're more likely to be thinking in that negative and in that, okay, what's it going to be like if we go 0-7, is the example from what's happening right now. So I think that's also like really, really important. The thing that I would say around simulation training as well, it depends. As if you're practicing for a tournament, it's obviously a bit easier to kind of structure what you want to do with your practice, rather than practicing for a league where every week you're going to go to a stage. But something that I would always encourage people is to be very clear around what you're trying to get out of each practice. So it's great to do all this simulation stuff, but I think what people quite often do, and where I've seen it sort of fail in esports, is when people are like, well, it's just practice, but then we're going to do it with crowd noise or on a little mini stage that we've made, or we invite some people, which I think, it can be useful. But the point is that we should try and treat it like it's a game, you know? So you don't want to be learning new things going on a stage, like to go on a stage, you know, and do a fake stage. So if you're doing whatever you're doing, exploratory or execution practice, like it should be your maximum 100% execution practice should be the practice that you also add in this kind of simulation training sort of idea, and thinking about, okay, how can we increase the pressure? Because it could be that you're not in a situation where, you know, playing crowd noise can be good because it's, you know, getting used to distraction like you're talking about. But then there's also, it's mostly like the pressure is different. So how could we increase the pressure in this practice? And it could be something silly and it could be something serious. But we've actually talked about this before, which is why I'm going to ask, what are some ways that you've experimented in the past of increasing the pressure if people are sort of still struggling with this? So we don't necessarily have the luxury of being able to invite people to watch. We don't have access to, we'll use the LEC as an example. We don't have access to the LEC stage to practice. We don't have great speakers to pump in crowd noise. Like, how can we do some sort of simulation training?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it's one, you know, we used to talk about this a lot back when I did my master's years ago in sports psychology, and it was, how do you ethically introduce additional pressure without being unethical? You know, how you don't want people to feel like they're going to lose their job if they don't do it. You don't want people to feel, you know, anxious to an extreme extent at all. So how do we subtly introduce pressure that might be similar to, you know, a game day in front of a crowd that doesn't have the same ramifications? You know, some of the smaller things would be kind of things around maybe media obligations, right? Maybe no one wants to do media all the time. I know that's generally a point of contention with some players. No one wants to have to do an interview here or there. The loser has to do media. You know, maybe people who struggle the most don't get to choose where we go for our team meal the next week. You know, just small pressures like that, which for some people obviously it's not going to be as much of a pressure at all, but for others it can be. And sometimes doing things around social media to promote the team, you know, having to sit down and write, you know, I don't know what it is, a small article about your time in the team, do an interview with the media team. That's kind of the safest areas, I would say. Definitely don't stray too far into introducing pressure that could actually hamper individuals' kind of well-being and so on, because there are some examples of that in wider sport world, which, you know, I would never recommend and never want to see of some coaches going a bit too far, I think, in trying to introduce pressure or and so on. And it still happens, and we would consider them quite unethical. And we are obviously, as sports psychologists, bound by our ethical code of conduct and frameworks and so on. So yeah, I would just say those subtle things, make a game of it sometimes. You know, maybe if it's a small thing and everyone is paid enough, you know, maybe it's a small, well, you have to pay for lunch, you know, tomorrow, you know, or something like that, just to add a tiny bit of that extra pressure. But I'd be intrigued on your thoughts on that as well, John, if you've ever come up with anything that kind of fits well.
No, I don't think I've never found something that I've been really happy with. We have experimented with a bunch of different things like that. The other thing is that I've also been head of video somewhere. And if I'm told as the head of video, right, we're going to send you the players who've just lost because you're the punishment, that's probably not going to lead to the best videos.
Probably, yeah, true.
But you know, maybe it's something that you have to do. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I have struggled with in the past, and I think the best, to be honest, the best, most helpful part has just been talking about it. And whether you call it simulation game or execution practice or whatever, having some specific games that are like, right, this we're treating like it's the game as best as possible. I think that was the most helpful thing that we could manage. And I'm not saying it's super helpful. This is one of those things where if you could find someone who could actually make people play on stage as well as they play in scrims, they would be the most valuable person in esports overnight. So I definitely don't have the answers, but we've done that before. We've also done, you know, a whole block is we're going to play a best of 5 versus this team instead. And I think then, you know, you could have a bit of fun with it. I personally am never very secretive about the things that I'm doing because I don't think they're particularly complicated. So I would even, you know, if it's going to be you're the best LFL team and you're doing a serious best of 5 against the best LVP team, make some sort of social media punishment around it where whoever loses has to tweet that the other person's the best team and all this kind of thing. And it's like, look, it's just a bit of fun. It's also good for engagement. It also shows that you're trying something a bit different, but also it is actually something that no one really wants to do. So there are a few things to try, but I think, Yeah, the first step that I think most teams don't do is actually be clear about what you want from every practice that you're in. And is this a practice where we're trying to explore and learn new things, or is this a practice when we're trying to really drill the stuff that we do well, and therefore we should be already expecting, less mistakes, more seriousness, all this kind of thing. And that already might not be proper simulation training, but it can get you sort of some of the way there.
Yeah.
Although I've tried to do at one point, I also tried to run a 10-man roster, but unfortunately, as soon as it started, someone else was brought in to run it who didn't actually want to run it, despite what they said. So it all kind of fell apart. But one of the things that we were going to experiment with is we were all training from the same facility, but each team had a different room. But it wasn't like this was the LEC team's room and this was the UK team's room, because it was with Excel. It was just, these are two rooms, and we were going to tell them every day, this is the room that you're going to be in, and the next day you don't know until I tell you which room you're going to be in. And so you go and set up on the monitor like you would normally, and people bring in their own, keyboard and mouse just like you would anyway. And so you have a bit of that, and we were going to experiment with that kind of thing as well. But of course, the second people said it was too much effort, it was then dropped because it wasn't my decision in the end. But yeah, I think there's things to do, but it's well, like I said,
it's never going to be perfect, is it? It's never going to be the ideal, but it's all about getting as close as possible. And I think what's really important, and I'm glad you highlighted it there, is doing the foundations right. If you are doing a simulation training session, it has to be clear to players that you're not playing to learn, you're playing to win today. Like we would on stage, we're playing to win. And what does that involve? How does that mean we're going to speak? Does that mean we can laugh and joke in between? If we would do that in performance anyway, then yeah, of course. If you wouldn't, then no. And how much can the coach speak to me? Is the coach going to talk to me at all? In these things, just like they would in a real thing. So yeah, all those small things that you would keep in mind. Yeah, try and do in simulation training. I love that idea as well of having to set up. The amount of times I've had to help players prepare and take every single bit of information and scrap of paper that tells them their settings, everything they need, all the perfect measurements for certain things, before they go to LAN. That is a very, very key point. Something that does come up a lot.
Okay, so we're just going to end with some quick fire questions. If anyone hasn't seen this, I'm asking everyone the same questions, just to, firstly, because they're interesting, but also just to show that we all come from very different backgrounds. So who are the coaches that you look up to or idolize either now or early on in your career?
It's a really good question. I think I'm going to stretch the definition of coach in this one, John. I hope you don't mind. But I've chosen Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, who was considered one of the best practices really of practitioners, of Stoicism and kind of that mentality and mindset. Because you could argue he coached many people under him to try and be good people. He was coached by some brilliant philosophers as well. But I love his writings, especially the meditations, because it was his personal diary. It was never supposed to be seen by anyone. It was the ramblings of this emperor who was really trying to hold together this empire, this kind of whole nation that he had under him, whilst struggling with his own personal things. And you find out in these meditations, in this diary of his, how challenging that was, but all the things that kept him kind of managing those. And I think one of the main reasons why I enjoy reading about Aurelius is because, despite the fact he had almost everything in the world, he still held himself to normal person standards. He wouldn't allow himself to think of himself as an emperor as better than anyone. And I think that's the beauty in it. I think there's a similar quote. He may have made it. It may have been made by another Stoic, which is kind of around, if you look at the man who has it all, or when a man can have it all, that's truly when they show who they really are. And this man had it all, and he was still trying to be the best person. He wasn't perfect, of course. There were many issues of that time, but the fact that he was trying to is something I look up to massively. And I think it's something we can all take something from, is wanting to do the best that we can with what we've got. And I guess the question I'd ask to everyone, including myself, and I often do, is, if I was an emperor, if I had everything at my fingertips, would I still be the person I would want to be, or would I slip here and there, morally, ethically, etc., whatever it is? And I think that's something that, I don't know if any of us could answer it fully truthfully, but it's something that I strive to hopefully one day be able to say I would still be a good person, or as the person I want to be. So yeah, apologies for stretching that on a little bit, but it was just something that I've been really thinking on for the last few years now.
It's perfect. I mean, everyone, as well as you can get great modern translations of meditations and stuff like that, which I definitely recommend. But also looking into Ryan Holiday for people who are interested more in this. He does a lot of, well, basically all his entire work is based off of Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the biggest hardship you've experienced as a coach?
I think that the biggest hardship, kind of in my journey, I think as a sports psychologist, was probably um, I think the 7 years it took to qualify, to be fully qualified. It's a long road to becoming in the UK a psychologist. It's a protected title. It's legally protected, so it means you can't call yourself a psychologist if you're not one, effectively. So yeah, it took 7 years to train, which included an undergrad degree, included a postgrad degree, and then includes further training, almost similar to kind of like a junior doctor, where you're supervised in the field, as it were. But in sports psychology, you have to find and make your own placements. So I was setting up a business whilst also being a trainee for the final years of kind of doing this qualification, and it was taxing, very difficult. I learned a lot of brilliant skills, but it was very hard even getting onto the training route, let alone being able to pay my way through it and then set up the business so the business itself could be profitable eventually. Yeah, I would say that was a massive hardship, but one I would do over again, of course, in a heartbeat, because it's given me the opportunities I have today and the job that I absolutely love today.
Yeah, one thing we didn't have time to talk about this time, and we'll have to do another time, is the differences between, psychologist, the performance coach, mental coach, all that kind of thing.
Yes, there are big differences. I can briefly, mention it now, to be fair, if you'd like.
I mean, if you've got time, I've still got a few more questions to go. So.
Yes, it's okay. Don't worry. Yes, I think there are key differences, and I would say the key thing, at least in the UK, is to be reassured that if someone is calling themselves a sports psychologist, again, that's a legally protected term. They have to have achieved certain markers of quality to be able to call themselves that, or they could be a trainee on a route towards achieving that. So that involves an undergrad degree, master's degree, and then further study, and that can be a PhD, prof doc style thing, or the thing I did, which is a private course set up by the British Psychological Society. The certificate's actually right there. I'm very proud of that one, because it took a long time to do. And there are real long assignments, reflections, and supervision that needs to be made to ensure that you are qualified and quality. And at the end of it, you'll be set through a viva where you're assessed to basically see have you made it or not. And the British Psychological Society and their assessors will decide whether you can be a psychologist. And then you can join the HCPC in the UK, which is the Healthcare Practitioner Council, which effectively govern doctors, nurses, anyone who provides care to anyone. Because we're psychologists, it's technically classed as care. So we do have to abide by their code of conduct, their ethics documents, etc. So if you're a team taking on a sports psychologist, and you've done your due diligence and research, that they will probably be very well versed, very understanding of confidentiality, ethics agreements. And it's good as well for teams insurance, because I always like to kind of talk about this with teams who might be thinking about sometimes bringing on someone who's not qualified but may call themselves a psychologist or may present themselves as one. There are kind of liability issues with that if something does go wrong. You're employing someone who might not be qualified to discuss something, and they're given bad advice maybe, and something's happened as a result of that, then the team is potentially liable for that along with that individual. So something as well that's reassuring to teams is if you're working with a sports psych who is doing sports psychologist things, then they are covered for that. They have insurance, etc., etc. But that's not, of course, to put any other of the professions down. Performance coach and mental coach are very important, I think, in esports especially. I would say performance coach is there's a huge kind of wealth of areas that a performance coach could work in. You could be a mentor, you could work with the coaches themselves, you could work around how to enhance performance themselves. And often people with these titles have their own educations around specialist areas in performance. I've seen many performance coaches who have PhDs either in things like psychology or biomechanics or nutrition, etc. So they might be qualified in individual areas, but again, it does become blurry if these people are straying into what a psychologist might do, or giving advice that a psychologist is qualified to give, and they may not be. And then mental coach, again, it's very loose. Mental coach is often something that people might think is very similar to a psychologist, and to some extent it can be. But again, what in the UK at least a mental coach might be able to do might be quite limited compared to what a sports psychologist might do. And there are some brilliant mental coaches out there. Absolutely, they know their craft, they have great experience, and I hope they share that and continue to. But there are a lot of, I guess, posts online and things that I would say are misleading in terms of the benefits they might have, who they might work for, and how effective they can be. Just like in anything, really. And I understand that, but again, I would say do your research if you're looking to pick up a mental coach or sports psychologist. Look at the experience they have, the education, and really ask yourself what you might want them for. Because if you're hiring a mental coach and you don't necessarily let them know that you actually want them to help support the well-being of your players, then that might be a shock to them as well, because they might be like, well, hang on, I'm not 100% on board with that. I might not have the right courses to support that, but again, they might do. So yeah, we actually wrote a bit about this in our chapter that should be coming out soon, around kind of different levels of coaching and psychology and where they mesh, and it is blurred, very blurry lines. So yeah, it's not easy at all. And as you can tell by my explanation, it's not succinct.
Yeah, and especially that's even just talking about one country, let alone coming from anywhere else in Europe as well. I think the biggest thing that I would say for the organizations is just be very, very cautious if someone is kind of over promising. It's like if someone has some knowledge in the field, it might be, okay, we'll do this and that'll fix it. And someone has a lot of knowledge, you'll probably get more like, well, I don't know, it depends on the person. It's all
that's true, actually. That's a really good a barometer. If people are overly confident and certain in one technique that will fix everything, I would be very cautious. But
okay, so next of the quickfire questions then, what's your top highlight as a coach?
I think one of my favorite moments, and this is because it was such a challenge and the players I was working with dealt with it so well, was a couple of years ago when I was working with Team Endpoint. Got a lovely jersey there with my name on it. They gifted me, bless them. It was very nice of them. I was working with Team Endpoint. We were at their facility in Watford, playing a LAN event with the Rocket League team, and we'd done some sessions in the morning. We were preparing, getting ready to go into the tournament, which was due in an hour, and then the internet cuts out, and we were like, oh, that's not ideal. Gigabit internet line's gone down completely. We were like, oh, thank goodness, there's a second line. So we hook up the second line, and the second line is also down. And we were like, oh my goodness. Okay, so what do we do now? So we sat around, we weighed up our options. Everyone stayed very calm. But I think it's one of my favorite memories because it just shows the absurdity and the challenges sometimes you face in esports. So we had to unpack everything from that boot camp room. We took the PCs, we took the monitors, and in my car I strapped all the PCs into the seats, had them in the boots. They were seat belted up, and then the Rocket League coach took the players in his car, and they were carrying their peripherals, everything they needed. We locked up the facility, and we drove around the other side of London to the owner of Team Endpoint's apartment, to his flat. And he was a legend, very kindly let us use his dining room table, and we set up our new boot camp at his flat, and we played a tournament that day and got to the final, and they did really well. Unfortunately, I think they lost the final, but that's my favorite memory because it just shows how you don't get that in traditional sports. You don't have to travel across to get new internet at the owner of your team's house and set up in his dining room on these plastic flimsy chairs and then expect them to perform just as well. But again, they performed just as well as we could have hoped, and it almost became like mythological in its memory. Whenever times were hard, we could always look back to that and go, well, at least we don't have to drive through London and go set up in someone else's flat.
That's amazing. I love it. Okay, what are 3 non-negotiable behaviors that people around you need to buy into?
The desire to learn, or at least to work together. It's challenging to work with people who've been told to come and see me, rather than people who, of their own choice, have said, I want to go and see Callum, because there's a whole extra layer of that. I want people to be open to accepting what we talk about, and it's very difficult if they're not. It's a waste of both of our time if they don't want to be here, and they're not going to listen to what we have to talk about anyway. So that would be one thing. I think from the team perspective, access to players, and an understanding that sports psych isn't just a quick fix. There is no silver bullet that's going to solve everything instantly. It does take time, just like going to the gym takes time to build muscle. With a lot of these things, it takes time to build those mental kind of patterns and habits as well. And then I think finally the behavior, just be open to discussion. I love a good chat, as you can tell. I don't stop talking once I get going, but being open to kind of go back and forth on that. And I'm very open to being challenged on anything as well that I suggest or might feel that is true from my perspective. I love discussing these things with people, and it's very understandable if people are, not keen to discuss and talk, but it does make things kind of hard when we get to the nitty gritty of, what's going on for people.
Great. Last question then. If you, from today, could give yourself one piece of advice when you first started your coaching journey, what would it be?
Yeah. I know exactly what it could be, and it's probably a bit of a window into what I'm like as a person. But I think if I could give myself one piece of advice from right at the start, I would say, ask yourself, Callum, what if it goes well? Instead of what if it doesn't go well? What if it's bad? What if it's scary? What if you mess up here? What if they don't hire you? What if you have to work for free for even longer and you can't afford this, that, the other? Instead, flip it on its head, Callum. Just ask, well, what if you do make it? What if they do hire you? What if you do get those connections? Because I've been very lucky, in where I've worked in the past, more often than not, it has gone really well. And asking myself that at the time, I would have saved myself a lot of nervousness, a lot of negative self-talk that is much better now, obviously. But when you're a young trainee and there is a tough journey ahead of you, it's very easy to fall into those traps of, oh, what if I get it wrong? What if I don't know everything? What if they ask a question I don't know the answer to in my first ever workshop, and I'm all fresh-faced and scared? So yeah, that's probably one piece of advice I would give, is just ask yourself, what if it goes right?
Great. What a fantastic way to end. Well, thank you very, very much for coming. It was very, very good, and we'll definitely have to do another one.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure we've got infinite amounts to talk about. Absolutely. So thank you for having me on, John, as well. I do appreciate it, and hope you continue to have a lovely day and lovely times working with your coaches.